Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Maloney, and I'm the Director of Communications at Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. I want to start off by wishing everybody a happy Global Ethics Day. Whether you're here at the Council or watching remotely, our team is grateful that you have chosen to join us. It's a special day at Carnegie Council for a few reasons. First, today marks the 10th anniversary of Global Ethics Day. Over the past decade alone, individuals, institutions, schools, and businesses from over 100 countries have participated in this day of ethical action. Together, we've built a community that truly is working to empower ethical action in public life. Second, this is our first event at the Council in over 2 years. After making it through COVID and a series of building renovations, I know I speak for our entire team when saying how thrilled we are to welcome so many new faces to the Council community. For over a century, Carnegie Council has served as the most trusted advocate for solutions at the intersection of ethics and international affairs. We know that ethics has the power to create positive change. It's a tool that can be applied to promote a more peaceful world, address emerging technologies such as AI, and tackle climate change. We're here today to discuss one of the virtues of an ethical life, cooperation. How can we motivate individuals to cooperate, and how can we enhance cooperation at the international level? Critical questions for this very moment. To lead today's discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joel Rosenthal. As president of Carnegie Council and editor of Ethics and International Affairs Journal, Joel has dedicated his career to empowering ethical reflection and action across the areas of human rights, war and peace, and pluralism. And with that, I pass the microphone over to Joel. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Beautifully said. You deserve that applause. Beautifully said and much appreciated. It's good to be here with all of you, our live studio audience, and all of you watching around the world. And as you say, good reminder, this is a homecoming for us and a reopening of our offices here, and so there's extra energy in the room today. The fact that Global Ethics Day is now 10 years old and growing fast, is a testament to the need for ethics in our personal and public lives. We're glad that Carnegie Council can be the home and be that place for that work. And this is especially true given recent world events. The war in Gaza and Israel is likely top of mind for many of you today, with President Biden's visit to the region. And of course, there are many other challenges to peace and cooperation as we sit here, including the war in Ukraine, civil unrest in Africa, and ongoing crises like the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, and so on. So for this reason, we thought we would engage in some counter-programming against the news cycle. And the idea is to feature some positive ideas on how we might work together on these difficult challenges. And so our topic today is unlocking cooperation. It's no secret that cooperation is in high demand but short supply. So what can we do about it? And that's why we called the two of you. And we're so glad that you would join us today. So brief introduction of our panelists. Erez Yoeli is research scientist and director of MIT's Applied Cooperation Initiative. His recent book is Hidden Games: The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. And Abi Williams, a dear old friend, welcome back to the Carnegie Council. Professor of Practice at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. And as his title suggests, he's held several high-level positions in the practice of international diplomacy, including serving as Director of Strategic Planning for 2 UN Secretary Generals. So we're going to have a conversation for about 50 minutes. We'll try to make it lively and conversational among us. We're going to open it up for questions, so get your questions ready, both in the room and out there in virtual space. So I'm going to kick it off with a question to Erez. So to begin, I'd like to hear a little bit about your work on how to think about cooperation. At Carnegie Council, we're working on global scale issues that require collective action. Issues like AI, migration, climate. What does your research into cooperation tell us about people's capacity to cooperate, not just with their neighbors, but across cultures and countries. Erez, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you for having me. One thing the research highlights is that even though, as you said, cooperation seems like it's in short supply, humans are actually exceptional cooperators, standing out amongst other species, and particularly the ones who are closest to us, other primates, in terms of how effective we are at cooperating. We cooperate more, and we cooperate at a larger scale than most other primates. It's pretty common to see other primates engaging in you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and so there is some cooperation amongst them, but humans are able to extend that into much, much larger groups. We see, for instance, as far back as there is an archaeological record, the humans engage in activities like collective fishing, collective hunting, warfare, sadly, as we well know. We have records of all of those, and they often involve dozens of individuals or hundreds of individuals, and that kind of collective action is something that is actually fairly unique. You really have to go to the eusocial insects to find other animals that will engage in activities at that level, at that scale, engage in cooperation at that scale. And so there is, to some extent, it is true that cooperation is in short supply, but we actually have the ability to do it. And that's kind of the good news. It wouldn't be in short supply. The fact that it is in short supply is only relevant because there is this good side to it, which is that we can do it. We can cooperate with strangers, with people from outside cultures, and so on. It can be more challenging. A lot of cooperation tends to be focused on helping our group. So working across group lines tends to be very difficult. But we have the ability to do it. So I'll start with that.
All right, that's a good setup. I'll come back to you. I want to go to Abi, maybe just a comment on Erez's intro and any thoughts you have based on your experience in terms of sort of capacity for cooperation.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Yeah. Thank you very much, Joe, for inviting me to this really important discussion. And it's good to see you again. We're very good friends, and we go back a long way. I think what Erez has said, I think he highlights the point that the responsibility for cooperation falls to us at different levels. Most fundamentally, we are responsible as individuals for our actions, for our attitudes, for our approach to the world. I also think that, at least at the international level, cooperation is a tool to achieve altruistic purposes at times, but it's also a tool to promote geopolitical interests. And it can also be a tool for states to try to enhance and burnish their reputations. You asked about some of my own experiences. I joined the United Nations in the mid-1990s and in peacekeeping, and my first peacekeeping mission was with the UN Preventive Deployment Force in what is now North Macedonia. It was the UN's first, and so far its only preventive peacekeeping mission. And at the time there were internal tensions, especially between the ethnic Macedonians and the ethnic Albanians. And so the Security Council decided, they adopted a resolution, and they asked the special representative of the Secretary General to use his good offices to try to promote peace and stability in the country. So on the basis of that mandate, we were able to work with the major political parties. And in the run-up to the presidential and parliamentary elections in 1994, we brought all the major political parties together, and they signed a code of conduct for the elections, as well as principles for interethnic cooperation. And both the code of conduct for the elections and the principles which they adopted helped to bring about a relatively peaceful election and to promote stability in the country. I think that was a very good example of the kind of work that we did and the kind of work that the UN does.
That's great. This is a really good beginning. So cooperation is possible, and as Erez says, we're actually pretty good at it as human beings. So the question is, how do we scale it up, right? So I want to get to this notion that we have global scale problems. So for the purposes of this discussion, let's think about climate as an example, right? So this is a global scale problem, which requires global scale cooperation. So how do we move from the capacity to cooperate in relatively small groups or even regional groups to solve particular problems to something broader? How would you think about that challenge?
It's a tough challenge. I could imagine taking this answer in so many directions. But I'll start by just talking about how we even think about the math of it. So how do we get to the point where we're getting cooperation between more than two individuals? So cooperation, we'll start by defining it. Cooperation is paying a cost to benefit others at the most basic level. And so you're demanding that somebody do that, and you have to give them some sort of motivation to do that. And typically the way people think that this gets solved is through some sort of repeated interaction and future benefits from that repeated interaction. But that's usually a model of interaction between two people. There's no scale there. So how do we go and expand the scale? And usually what people do is they write down models of norm enforcements. And without going into too much math, basically now we have more than two players in these little game theory games. And it can be as many players as you want, and it can be global. And what you do is you ask the individual to engage in some sort of behavior that is costly to them, conserving a resource, buying an electric vehicle instead of a gas-powered vehicle, even though it's a little bit more expensive or maybe a little bit less convenient, something like that. So there's an individual level cost. And then you have to motivate them in some way. What that requires is a little bit of rewards and punishments from everybody around and coordination around what it is that we are going to reward and punish. And so that kind of thing, the psychology that requires, and that kind of behavior is the kind of thing that we think humans are really good at, and enables us to then scale to levels like the ones that you were talking about, because you're able to basically take everybody in the room and allow them to help to motivate the cooperative behavior.
This is a perfect setup for Abi, because I know you said you teach a course in global leadership, right? Or building capacity for global leadership. So I'm just curious, based on what Erez was saying, so how do you then take this sort of insight and sort of, as you think about leadership training for, to make progress on something like in a global institution with sort of a global mission?
Well, as you were saying, international cooperation is difficult, particularly at the present moment, when you have rivalry among the major powers and intense rivalry. You also have conflict in different parts of the world. You have dissension in the UN's intergovernmental bodies, and then we're seeing backsliding on a number of normative and international legal commitments. I do teach a course on leadership and global institutions at Tufts, at the Fletcher School, and I think the reason for that is leadership makes a difference, and if you're scaling up, leadership matters, and the quality of leadership is critical for us to address the range of global challenges that we're facing, because leadership can help to bring divergent interests together, and leadership can also help to come up with bold yet practical plans to address a range of issues, including the climate. And leadership is also important for reforming global institutions. I think when all is said and done, there's very little you can do without leadership, and leadership which is far-sighted, leadership which is underpinned by humane values, and leadership which is also courageous, because none of these issues are easy, and you're trying to bring about parties who all have to make painful compromises.
All right, so you two gentlemen are very reasonable, and we're speaking in the language of reason, right? So I'm looking out into the world right now, and we see a lot of emotion. And we may also see, it's in the subtitle of your book, there is, irrational behavior, right? So we have to enter the world as we experience it, and we understand it's there. So how do you deal with this sort of, again, we're talking about trying to think about unlocking cooperation right around collective action problems, and yet how do we deal with the problem of unreason or irrationality?
A lot of what we do actually is attempting to engage those emotions. And so to some extent, we may come at this as if like, oh, we're analyzing a game theory model and everybody out there is a rational actor, but really what we're doing is modeling the emotions per se. And so our aim is to use some of the same tools that we would use to analyze things like the very simple model I just presented in front of all of you. We would use that to model where the emotions come from and then say, how would one activate them? And we tend to use fairly simple things to do that. If we're talking about cooperation at the within group level at least, then we would tend to do things like give people recognition for good deeds, or try to reduce plausible excuses for doing good deeds, because those excuses basically undermine the motivation, or do things like communicate expectations very clearly, something that leadership is very important for. And so oftentimes we're going to do things that are fairly simple, acting at often the emotional level. We don't think people are necessarily reasoning through this,
Right.
but based on a reasonable, rational analysis at a scientific level.
So just so I understand correctly, so you sort of accept in a way the sort of the emotion or the irrational.
Yeah, lean into it.
And then you try to sort of then apply reason from there, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Give the right emotions a good reason to come out.
To come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you can think about, say, international institutions as struggling with this continuing battle within reason and unreason. And, of course, the 20th century gave us some really awful and tragic examples of unreason, from the Holocaust to the genocide in Bosnia to Rwanda. You have lots of examples, tragic examples of unreason. But you also have examples of reason, where you have a whole ecosystem of international institutions, notably the UN and its agencies. You have regional organizations. So we're constantly in this battle between reason and unreason. And as in discussion with the students, you always have to be on guard, and you cannot take anything for granted. And I think history teaches us in its most tragic moments that the path towards progress is seldom linear, and what it requires is continual effort, and not only continual effort, but expertise being shared across borders and across disciplines and across generations. But it's a constant battle between reason and unreason.
Right. So I wasn't going to go there, but I'm just curious what you both think, because one of the themes I've been trying to think about is, in social science terms, we call about normative shift, about how norms change over time, right? And just in terms of direction, I'm curious where you see, where we are now in terms of progress towards peace and cooperation, because on a normative level, in terms of recognizing this sort of the aspiration, I would argue that it's relatively high, but then in terms of what we see in the world, obviously relatively low. But I'm just curious, do you have a sense of direction? How are we doing as a global society at this moment?
You should type this one.
Yeah. Start with that. Yeah.
Well, I think the record is mixed.
Yeah.
You have some hopeful developments and developments which are not so hopeful.
Yeah.
So it's rather mixed. And in terms of normative development, In the area of norms, there's a role for norm entrepreneurs who make a huge difference in terms of the development of norms.
Right.
And UN Secretaries General play a critical role in terms of the development of norms. So, for example, I think of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, my former boss, who was very acutely aware of the importance of developing norms. And he challenged, of course, member states to come up with a question of how you deal with genocide and mass atrocities, and really advocated two sovereignties, one for people and one for states, and was a great advocate for the responsibility to protect, which all the member states unanimously adopted at the World Summit here in New York in 2005, as a way to set up a new norm, R2P, which will deal with this very intractable issue of human protection and how you protect the sanctity of human life. So it's an important role norm entrepreneurs play in developing new norms for conduct. But as I say, it's sort of mixed.
Yeah.
You have norms which are developed, and then you have backsliding, which occurs as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point. I think it's a really important one, that it's always mixed. You always have sort of progress and regression at the same time. We have to sort of try to understand that. Erez?
Yeah, I mean, even norms that are good for most of us most of the times are sometimes not that good for one particular group, and they're going to push against them. Sometimes they'll succeed. We have an example of a norm that is at risk of backsliding is a norm against the use of chemical weapons that has been upheld for something on the order of a century. And then Assad comes along, and it's not quite clear that we responded sufficiently strongly that it would prevent future use of chemical weapons, which worries me. But an example of a norm that has been upheld, that has been longstanding, is the war against territorial incursions against sovereign nations. The West has stood pretty firmly behind Ukraine against Russia's incursion, and that has been, I think, good to uphold that norm and make sure that for a new century and for a new era, we're saying still we are at least united in upholding that norm.
Yeah. Great. So, in addition to sort of concerns about sort of, ideology, or sort of people who have sort of a single moral truth, and they're committed to their own position to the extent of ignoring others. This is one basket of issues. But the other is the concern about sort of, I would call it apathy, or what can I do, or sort of irrelevance, right? So last year at Global Ethics Day, we had Michael Shore, who wrote a wonderful book on ethics called How to Be Perfect. But what I recall from that conversation is we had a very robust discussion of the free rider problem, which is, okay, we look out into the world, this is very overwhelming to us, and so, why do I need to, sort of, it's not just apathy, but just this sort of sense of helplessness, or not being able to do anything in a collective action kind of problem. So I'm just curious how you both think about this sort of this free rider notion, or the bystander idea. How do we sort of generate some discussion about, individual agency, if you will. So maybe Erez, I'll start with you on that, since it's your field.
Usually when we are thinking about the free rider problem, it's more in the space of things like, are you doing your duty when it comes to conserving energy and helping us to, say, prevent a blackout, or helping us have a modernized grid that doesn't use fossil fuels as much, or something like that. Right. Or we might be using it in the space of a pandemic to get people to do things like vaccinate or wear masks, or things like that, where we're trying to slow the spread of a pandemic. So a slightly different space, but I think a lot of the same tools would typically apply. We look at this underlying norm enforcement psychology, and we say, how do we activate it? Typically, we have three key tools that we use. I very quickly referenced them earlier, but again, we tend to try to reward good deeds. We kind of think of them as a little bit like an investment. you put in money into an investment vehicle, you want it to have a return. Cooperation is kind of the same way. The return isn't in money, it's in reputation and good standing and so on and so forth. So we try to give people that reputational return on their cooperative investment. And then we also think about things that tend to undermine that reputational reward, and in particular, the role of plausible deniability and plausible excuses. The more excuses you give somebody, the less their reputation is really tied to the cooperative action. Mm-hmm. So if you can bring that together, the way that you bring that together is you pull out the excuses that really drive the wedge between them. So we think a lot about what kind of excuses can somebody give and how do we eliminate them. And then the third thing that we do is we really think very, very carefully about what are we asking people to do and how do we communicate that clearly. Here again, we have a role for entrepreneurs, for leaders to step in. They're often typically the folks who people look to try to understand what they're expected to do in a particular context, and expectations are very important in cooperative contexts. Sometimes there are cooperative things that you do, but you're just not, you could do, but you're not really expected to do them. An example that we give is if you're from New York, you stand on the right on the escalator. If you're from the West Coast, which is where I live at the moment, people just hang out on the escalator. In both cases, letting somebody by is cooperative, but only in one place you're expected to do it.
Yeah.
And so we really think very clearly a lot about how do we communicate expectations here, which I think is something that you guys are thinking a lot about as well. So those are our three things that we do to try to fight the free rider problem in our context.
Yeah. Free riding is a huge problem for international cooperation. It's one of the biggest obstacles to get nations to cooperate on important global issues. We don't have a world government, and I don't think we're going to have one anytime soon, right? So if we had one, it could help us deal with the free rider problem, as national governments help with the free rider problem at the national level. And in addition to not having a world government, international institutions often lack the legal authority to enforce commitments and contributions which would eliminate the free rider problem. So what are we left with? I think two things could help. The first is to try to push for globally recognized, internationally legal binding agreements, because most of the agreements dealing with issues, including on the climate, are voluntary. But I think if there's a push to have globally recognized, legally binding agreements, this could help eliminate or at least reduce the free riding problem. I think the second thing which could help would be to try to push to have enforcement mechanisms. Difficult at the international level, more difficult at the domestic level, but not unprecedented to have enforcement mechanisms internationally. And the more enforcement mechanisms you have, and states know that they will be held accountable if they're free riders, I think those are two, practical things that could help deal with this really huge challenge to international cooperation.
So this, though, then raises the question of legitimacy in some way, right? So as you're speaking, right, it requires an international institution that's seen in some ways as having that legitimate legal authority. So I guess the way you get there is through treaty, right? Through agreement.
Exactly.
Right.
I think through international treaties, and you build these in international treaties, and so that those who sign the treaties and ratify the treaties are held legally bound by the treaty.
Right. Great. So I want to go back to unreason for a minute.
We're not being unreasonable here.
No, because I think you've provided a great sort of normative framework, right? It's inspiring in many ways, and it also reflects, by the way, the sort of history of our institution and the things that we stand for, is promoting exactly that vision of international peace and cooperation, through commitment to institutions based on laws, norms, values, and so on. So it's a beautiful picture. So the world we're in today, though, is filled with all of this sort of unreason. We live in a very sort of populist moment, right? I think we all recognize this sort of rise of illiberalism, right? And illiberalism, by the way, which is sort of proudly, communicated, right? That people describing themselves as illiberal, right? I'll give you my read of this moment, which is leaders are being rewarded, go back into the leadership question, are being rewarded for actually dividing people into smaller groups, right? Into ethnic groups. What's your reflection or your thought about just sort of observing this rising populism, this rising illiberalism, and this notion of group conflict in a way, and leaders being rewarded for serving their ethnic group as opposed to the interests of others? Yeah.
I think one thing to recognize is that that is a form of cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a cooperation where the benefits are really directed towards a much smaller group of people. There's an analogy to trusts and cartels that are organizations that arise to cooperate within the marketplace for their benefit at the expense of the consumer. And the United States has put together a robust antitrust institutions and laws and so on in order to combat that. Something the founder of this institution would know something about.
He got his comeuppance. Well, we'll talk about it.
He did. But regardless, we do something about that kind of cooperation. Yeah. The same psychology, the same tools that we have to do good for everybody are sometimes co-opted to do good for just a small group. And I think that can be very dangerous, and we are seeing a lot of it. Sometimes we can combat that using kind of the inverse tools of the ones that we just introduced. To some extent, you can reduce the benefits to engaging in that kind of cooperation. You can introduce lots of excuses and kind of muddy the waters. You can send messages that mess up expectations and to some extent make it harder for the group to coordinate on its cooperative efforts. But to some extent, it's going to require more than that. It's going to require really stripping the incentives that leader has and aligning the incentives of that subgroup with other groups. And that's a different toolkit and very difficult. I imagine that you can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I think the sort of rising nationalism and populism in particular, there's a very dangerous trend because populism is essentially anti-democratic. Because at the heart of democracy is pluralism, and populists are allergic to pluralism, and they make a certain moral claim that they're the ones who represent the people. And the reason why I think it's dangerous to democracy, and because the more power they have, you have the potential for authoritarianism, and then they can decide which people in this polity are not part of the people. And it's up to them to decide who constitutes the people. So it's a very dangerous phenomenon. I think at the international level, one way that you can try to counter populism is through effective multilateralism. It is not enough to say we need multilateralism, but we need to show that multilateralism is effective. And that means understanding the root causes of why lots of people, huge segments in populations in different parts of the world feel as if they've been abandoned. And when you understand why they feel they've been abandoned, you begin to put multilateral programs, multilateral activities, plans to address their needs, and they feel that multilateralism is making a difference in their lives. I think that's one way you begin to counter it at the international level. But it's not, in order for multilateralism to be effective, it has to be networked. So the UN in the city has to cooperate closely with other international entities like the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, other agencies in the UN system like the World Health Organization, which has been dealing with the pandemic. You have to work with other agencies. And it's also critical to work with regional organizations such as the African Union, the EU, the OAS, and ASEAN in Southeast Asia. But you have to also go beyond sort of the networked nature of multilateralism. It also has to be inclusive. Mm-hmm. So it means bringing in non-state actors like think tanks, mm-hmm. Carnegie, working with the private sector, working with business, working with civil society, working with universities, so that you have an inclusive form of multilateralism. But I also do think that in an era of rising nationalism and populism, it's really, really important to affirm that global institutions and universal norms are not threats to particular identities mm-hmm. or particular interests.
That's great. I want to actually take another moment on this very, very important theme. And I think you were just speaking to it at the end there, Avi, about because there are communities that would be anti-plural, right? In other words, we want to keep our community in a particular identity in a way. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, there's still, with that as a given, that doesn't mean the prospects for cooperation end, right? Because there are still ways to find cooperation based on just different views of community and identity and so on. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think all of us have overlapping identities.
Right.
You say you can be a daughter, you can be a son, you can be a professor at Tufts, you can be a scientist at MIT. We have overlapping identities. And what populists try to do, and nationalists, is to put us in little boxes and to emphasize singular identities. But we all have overlapping identities. And these overlapping identities now in a globalized world are transnational. And I think it's important to reject the attempt to put human beings into boxes and to emphasize their singular identities, because then you're setting them up and you're creating the conditions for conflict. But I think we all have overlapping identities, and it's important to emphasize those and to cherish those. And the thing about democracy is that you have pluralism within democracies, and you can embrace different aspects of your identity, which is why it's so difficult and dangerous in authoritarian states, which tend to emphasize singular identities, a restricted notion of who constitutes the people.
Beautifully said. Thank you. I actually have just one more question that I'm going to raise, and then I do want to turn to the audience here and then also virtually out there. So get your questions ready. This is a question with regard to the conditions for cooperation. So I'm thinking about in terms of maybe a natural disaster, something like this, or let's say the electricity goes out in New York City, something like this. And you can see two types of results history will show us, and they may actually happen at the same time. But you see enormous cooperation, people helping each other out, right? Your neighbor and so on. And you all know these great stories of altruism, people helping, good Samaritans. But you also see sometimes these situations go sour, right? People, they start hoarding, they raid the grocery stores and so on, right? So, is there any science on this? Like what the conditions are? Why does it go one way one time, one way another time? I'm just curious what your work shows on the conditions for cooperation, when it works and when it doesn't.
Specifically around disasters, there's work from Joe Henrich's group. He's based out of Harvard. There's work from Michelle Gelfin's group, who's based out of Stanford, both showing that when there are national disasters, norms tend to tighten. That does tend to make it so that people basically adhere to norms more and enforce norms more. That's what tightening means, and as a consequence, you do get more cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
But the tightening also tends to tighten who gets cooperation and sometimes leaves some folks or some behaviors out. And then you get things like hoarding. And so there is very nice evidence. They do things like looking at across different cultures that tend to have more conflict tend to have tighter norms. They do things like look at particular natural disasters or a series of natural disasters, and they find that tightening and loosening over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that pattern that you're describing actually does show up in the data.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, when national disasters happen, they remind us of our common humanity. And they remind us that, fate can be really capricious and things can happen to us. And I think that's very important in motivating people to work together. I also think that at least at the international level, with states, reputations, again, can play an important part in this, both with states or with international agencies, because they can burnish their reputations in trying to foster cooperation. So there is a little bit of self-interest as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you oftentimes you have marrying together of moral imperatives and self-interests, like enhancing the reputation of a state, of an international organization, in helping when tragedy happens. So our common humanity, a driving force, and then enhancing reputations of individuals, of organizations, and of states.
Okay, I'm going to come to questions. So we're going to, do we have a microphone? Kevin? Terrence. Great. Actually, while we're waiting, I'm going to throw one out and then we'll come to you. So we didn't prepare for this one, but I'm going to ask you about this sort of effective altruism kind of argument. So this argument goes to the equal worth of all people, right? So in other words, proximity really shouldn't matter, right? What should matter is just utility, right? In other words, we should help those who are the least well off, no matter where they are. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is a viable long-term strategy for sort of global development? That, in other words, do we have the human psychological capacity to sort of empathize on a global scale, so that from a philanthropic perspective and from a help perspective, that resources will flow to the least well off no matter where they are, or does proximity still matter? Just curious.
Perhaps. It does seem like the effective altruists want us to ignore very natural tendency to empathize more and to be motivated more to help others who are very close to us. And it seems to me like there is a tension then between getting people who really need the money, versus getting people to be more motivated to give. And I think that there is a benefit to thinking about that tension, and the way you phrased the question, I think, highlights that tension. I think the effective altruists often bury that question, and that maybe is a mistake on their part.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think we certainly do have the capacity and the ability to help those who are not part of a community. And this is what cosmopolitanism is all about. Because at the heart of being a cosmopolitan is that you care not only for those within your own community, but you care for others outside your own community. And that you can have conversations across differences and bridge differences, and you have a spirit of empathy with those outside your own community. So I think one of the important things, again, that academia and universities can do is that we expose the students to the importance of these sorts of values, and that cosmopolitanism is key if we're going to live in a world where we have interconnected challenges and we have global challenges. In a sense, in a world where you have problems without passports. And if you have problems without passports and you need to find solutions without passports, you can't do that if you cannot relate and care for those outside your own community.
If I could make one academic reference here, based on your comments, Abi, is the work of Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Yes, of course.
Who's coined this phrase, rooted cosmopolitanism, where he's trying to make the point of embracing one's particular identity, and yet also carrying a commitment to a cosmopolitan view of the world. It's quite an elegant and compelling view of the world, which has made a great impression on me. And then also just another academic reference is Peter Singer's work, which is really at the root of much of the effective altruism movement. So just point of reference. There was a hand up over here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jackson Lopez. I'm a student at Bard College. And I guess the question I'm asking is, when we're thinking about the international system, a lot of people around the world will say that it's been led by the Americans, that for better or worse, American power has undermined kind of the norms and values that we have when we think about the international system, particularly at its most extreme regarding things like intervention. And there are multipolar alternatives to this, but many of them are quite particularistic. And they say that non-intervention in state affairs is really the key value. And there's much less about things like strong kind of global policy or values altering how countries should think. So I guess my question is, can there be a decisive international system that prioritizes values such as, for instance, legally binding climate agreements without hierarchy, or without the hierarchy we're currently seeing? And if so, how do we avoid kind of falling into a particularism that prioritizes states above all else? How can we keep that cosmopolitanism while decentralizing kind of the power that so far seems to be at the foundation of the international system?
This is your wheelhouse.
Well, thank you, Jackson. If you're an undergraduate, you can think of coming to Tufts for your graduate for training. Thank you. Interesting questions, a number of questions there. Let me just attempt this answer. I think in terms of the international system, states, for good or ill, are still the basis of the international system. And I don't think that's going to change in the short to the medium term. But it is clear that states cannot solve the whole range of issues that we're dealing with, from climate change, which you mentioned, to migration, to extreme poverty, to pandemics. We've been dealing with COVID-19. And that states need to work with non-state actors as well, civil society, business, and the private sector, NGOs, universities, so that they can play a role in coming up with ideas, coming up with strategies to deal with these problems. So I think you have states, but they also have to work with these other actors who have knowledge, they have expertise, and they have resources. In terms of values, I think if we're going to have an international system, it also has to be underpinned by certain values. It's difficult in a challenging international environment, but values such as solidarity, I think values of human rights, values of the rule of law are critical. And then I just say third, because you a number of important points in your question. We had, of course, during the Cold War, a bipolar system, and that was followed by a unipolar moment when we had unrivaled American hegemony. I think we're still in a period of transition where we're trying to move from we're not yet in a wholly bipolar world again, if you think about the United States and China, but yet in some other areas it's multipolar. So it's unclear what the world is now. It's a transition we're in, whether it's going to be a bipolar world or it's going to be a multipolar world. That's still in transition. But I think whatever outcome we see, there will be no single power, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's the rising powers like India and Brazil. None of these countries will be able to address these challenges on their own. And you need to find ways to have cooperation amongst these states to address these issues. It's an A for the question.
Yes.
Hi there, I can stand. Hi, I can speak. Okay, hi.
Great.
Tom Gilbert, I'm an expert on AI ethics, so I'm entering into this set of questions from the perspective of how you make algorithms for social good. And I think it actually bears directly on the free rider problem that was brought up earlier, in the sense that often when you're trying to optimize an AI system, there are these questions about how you make it so that all the parties that are going to be affected by that system are actually going to feed into it in the ways that make it perform well, perform optimally. And that concerns me because if you look at the practice of the way these systems are designed, it's a lot easier to just limit access from certain populations so that the only parties that can take part in the way the system works are the ones that have a self-interest in making it work well. To analogize that historically, we're in New York. There's this guy, Robert Moses, who was sort of individually responsible for designing a lot of the urban infrastructure for roads in the city, and the way he solved the free rider problem was to just exclude populations from people from riding free. You had to own a car to be able to use bypasses, highways, all sorts of situations. So the way the built environment can condition who can even have access to the infrastructure to make pluralism, those sorts of agreements where we can even coalesce on shared features of identities, these are all things that AI is going to exacerbate now and in the future. So I guess my question to the panel is, how do you see the AI conversation playing out with respect to the themes that you've highlighted about this need for international norms, cooperation, supranational standards possibly? And I just want to add briefly, I think the effective altruism movement has a mixed bag with respect to commitments to democracy and frankly also cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. But I'm not a member of that community, so I don't speak for it. Thank you.
So I've done a little work on that uses AI in the healthcare space. And one of the things that I have seen in that space is it doesn't get as much attention, but what the AI does is in fact reduce discrimination. Because if the AI is looking for a particular outcome and a group identity does not play a role in how it looks for that outcome, it ignores that. Whereas the human person trying to make that determination does not. And so one thing to recognize is that AI can play a role in both improving outcomes for groups that have traditionally been discriminated against, in addition to exacerbating them, as you have pointed out. There is, I think, and you will know more than I do about this, but I think it's very clear that in cases where algorithms are basically imitating humans and humans discriminate, we might want to restrict the algorithms from imitating on everything, and we might want to tell them you can't imitate some things. And in particular, the discrimination part, we're not going to let you do that. And that may make the algorithm perform less well on some measures of performance, but we're bringing in some other concerns that those performance measures just didn't include before. But I think that to some extent, I also think we should be using AI to combat the problems that the human psychology has, and this is a case where we can do that.
Well, I think generative AI is something we're all struggling with and trying to understand. Even at universities, we're trying to figure out ChatGPT? How do we, we know our students are using it. How can we bring it in when we think about our syllabus and as part of education?
And our exams.
He said, and their exams. So we have to think in an innovative way how we examine the students. I do think that AI has tremendous potential to help in the digital age. That is not to say that they're not huge concerns, and we need to acknowledge the genuine concerns about AI. For example, is it going to exacerbate the misinformation we already see on social media and different platforms? The degree to which AI might displace human beings and human labor, and what AI might do in terms of increasing surveillance by government. So there are genuine concerns about it. I do think that it has potential to help with the achievement of all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, for example. That's one area where it could help internationally. But there is a need to engage in multi-stakeholder discussions as how you use AI so it can help with these global issues like the SDGs, can help with peace and justice. And so that conversation needs to be had. And then we have to begin to figure out how we have the international governance of AI and this sort of new technology as we go forward. It's not going away, it's here, and like all good technologies, it's how do you make sure you use the benefits and you keep at bay the problems.
Erez, you look like you might want to say something else about AI. Did you, or?
No, I think.
Okay, no, guys didn't want to discuss.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
While we're waiting, we're going to have the next question up here, but I just want people to know that we have watching, I have a list here, Nepal, Norway, Ghana, Kenya, Canada, Spain, Portugal, Guatemala, Rwanda, Bahrain, Namibia, Mexico, South Africa, Panama, and then Texas. That's interesting. Texas, we love you. Nigeria, Haiti, Argentina, UK, Brazil, and United States. That's pretty impressive.
Right.
So, over here.
Hi, my name is Hassan. I'm an undergraduate at the City College of New York. And just to thank you guys for being here. I have a question for you guys. On a day for global ethics and a conference on cooperation, we must address the elephant in the room. We can all agree that the Hamas attacks on Israel were irrational, as you guys mentioned, and should be condemned. But I think it is more than fair to say that the Israeli response has been beyond irrational and downright atrocious. The West has cooperated in their support for Israel, but have abandoned the Palestinian people in their support. You mentioned about groups felt abandoned. And how does the international community cooperate multilaterally in addressing these severe human rights concerns in the region? And for the millions of civilians at risk, how do we overcome the vested interest of the existence of an Israel in the Middle East in favor of saving millions from a bleak future?
Abi first.
Sure. Well, Hassan, thank you very much for a very important, very thoughtful question. As we watch the unfolding tragedy in the Middle East, of course, the first thing is, our hearts, you feel for the victims and those who have lost their lives. It's a huge tragedy. But I think, and from my own experience, that we must never despair, even when a situation like this looks hopeless. You must never despair. And at this moment, I think we can draw strength and hope and inspiration from Ralph Bunche. Against all odds, that great black American and UN mediator negotiated armistice agreements between the Arabs and the Israelis, which brought about the end of the first Arab-Israeli war, for which Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. And again, it's important to look at those experiences and see what can be done, what an inspired mediator can do. And, you know, the peacemaker is blessed by Scripture. But oftentimes we underestimate the role that individuals can play in trying to resolve seemingly intractable problems which are not insoluble, and to bring warring sides together. And I think for me, Ralph Bunche has always been a great inspiration. Ralph Bunche and his heroic efforts in the Middle East to bring about those armistice agreements between Israel and all the Arab nations, his heroic efforts remind us that we must never lose sight of our common humanity. And again, to the point I made about leadership, that leadership is critical in bringing suffering peoples to the negotiating table, to bring about painful compromises, which are always necessary to bring about peace.
I'm afraid that anything I say is just going to make that answer worse. It is a terrible situation. It is likely to become a worse situation. There are a lot of things that one wants to uphold in the region that are sometimes in conflict. There is a norm against terrorism that is currently being upheld at the expense of many, many lives in Gaza. It is unclear whether, for the folks in Gaza, that is their preference. And we are ignoring their preference in going ahead and nonetheless enforcing the norms against terrorism in the particular way that we are doing. I do not want to pretend to think that I think that that is an unambiguous good. I see some good in that. Enforcing norms against terrorism makes some sense. Doing so at the expense of millions of lives is a very, very serious cost. And I don't feel like I have the answer.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. My name is Gilles Solio from City College. So, I think so. Basically, I want to go back on the framework of the values that guide cooperation and intervention. I mean, you've seen throughout the years that a lot of city-states or states have intervened in various conflicts, but not for the right reasons, right? Mostly because they were guided by self-interest. And unfortunately, because of that, it has resulted, they have taken kind of unreasonable actions, and because of that, devastating consequences had followed. But then my question is, where do we draw the line between cooperation and intrusion? And what kind of framework do you think we should put into place to prevent intrusion?
Do you want to talk about R2P a little bit?
Sure.
Or, I don't know. I don't want to cue you on that, but that's a good...
It's a good,
Yeah.
it's related to it. Well, I think in terms of intervening and intervention, states intervene for usually a number of different reasons. It could be partly altruistic. They can intervene for narrow national interests. They can intervene for geopolitical interests. They can intervene for economic interests. And sometimes they intervene for human rights considerations. So there's always a whole range of different reasons why states intervene. In terms, Joe talked about R2P, and I mentioned the case of former Secretary General Kofi Annan, because he looked at the experience of the international community not taking action in Rwanda, with 800,000 lives being lost, 800,000 in 100 days, the genocide in Srebrenica, And when he became Secretary General, felt that the international community had to come up with a new norm, which is why we have the responsibility to protect and the acceptance that that member states have first the responsibility to prevent their populations from the 4 mass atrocity crimes. But if that does not work, the responsibility falls on the international community to take action to prevent these things from occurring. Yes, we still have areas where there is a lack of action, but it's important to create that norm and to have a normative standard against which you can hold countries, hold countries and make them accountable. But I also think we should not forget there are times when, rather than intrusion, where states do not act when they should act, or the international community does not act. So it's not only a question of intrusion or intervention, but sometimes you want them to act when it's not happening. And that usually has to do with either a lack of political will, a narrow definition of their national interest, or simply indifference. So it's critical in those situations to generate political will. And that can be done both at the domestic level, where you have students, you have young people, you have civil society groups, you have all mobilizing, you have the media, so that political will can be generated. And then you also generate it at the international level. And this is one of the important roles of a UN Secretary General, to generate political will at the international level, to have action when it's necessary.
And I might just add one point, which is people's sense of ethics, people's sense of what's right and wrong often will follow what's good for them. And sometimes creating an environment in which it is good for them to intervene, but perhaps not too much, is what we really need. And that will, on the one hand, get you the motivation to intervene when that's helpful, and maybe not go so far as to prioritize your interests over others. So aligning the interests will often align the ethics as well.
Just to pause and build on that for just a second, and I'll come over here. But I'm curious about the motivation of a purely humanitarian, because your work is on altruism in a sense. How much traction does that have? Do you have a sense of that this is, my interest in this is humanitarian, period. Like, you know, that it's the right thing to do at a human level for empathetic reasons without interest involved. Have you looked at that? Or
I think it's not that we were born or like there is some innate desire to help all of humanity or something like that. I mean, we know that arises because of norms that have arisen, humanistic norms that arose. Most of these norms have origins in the 1600s and the philosophy of that period. It has been strengthened over time, and we have a system of norms that undergirds those humanitarian intuitions as well. And so there is a system in place that is aligning the incentives and sending the sense of ethics in that direction.
Yeah. Over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ariana. I am a sophomore at Fordham University. And I wanted to go back to the initial question and kind of get into multipolarism in the global order, but in the context of private actors showing up. For example, with Ukraine, we've seen Starlink emerge. So how could private people such as Elon Musk or private businesses interrupt ethics in the global order? And how could we kind of regulate ethical implications for private actors?
Want me to start? First of all, we just don't really have a set of norms yet. And so this goes back to the discussion that we had before about we need norm entrepreneurs. We need to start having those norms coalesce so that we know how somebody like Elon Musk should be behaving in this context. I mean, we know that, for instance, in the recent attacks that were just brought up, iPhones, social media played a critical role. Private organizations are playing a role there. We know that that's happening in Ukraine and so on. And right now, we do not have a global normative infrastructure to deal with that situation. So I guess maybe the one thing I will highlight is we kind of need to start thinking about that, having leaders come together and say, what will that look like, which will help a lot.
Yes, it's very difficult in conflict zones when you have not only states involved, you have international institutions, and you have civil society groups, NGOs, and private actors. It makes it very difficult, a huge problem for coordination as well. One of the areas where the UN has been playing a role, and one of the things that Kofi Annan did was when he tried to bring companies and the private sector to work with the UN and to adopt certain human rights standards. And that was the basis of what was the UN, the Global Compact, because historically the UN had an antagonistic relationship to the private sector, and the private sector was very suspicious of the UN. And he believed, again, in terms of leadership and being a non-entrepreneur, that you should begin to work with private companies, and for private companies, they could sign up to certain norms and certain standards, and that the UN could also benefit. And that could be a mutually beneficial relationship, and the Global Compact has really grown now into a really international initiative. I think that's one of the ways you look at it. Whether Elon Musk will sign up for it, well, that remains to be seen, but at least many, many companies have signed up to it. And I think it's the sort of initiative and the sort of practical way that you can get cooperation between states, international institutions, and the private sector.
Thank you. I'm going to ask sort of a journalist's kind of question. I'm Dean Emeritus of a journalism school, UNC Chapel Hill. And I want to thank Hassan for his question. Both of you are on campuses. So his question, I think, reflects a lot of the mood on campuses and the divisions and the worry. And we're talking about cooperation. But you're talking about diplomacy and leadership and action. Today, the president has gone to the Middle East, and there's been action. How do we think about that in this sort of moment of cooperation as a leader with all the kind of challenges that he faces, and who knows what's going to happen later today. But I'm wondering how both of you look at that kind of moment of leadership. Just some insight.
Yeah, I mean, I have no insights into what the president would be saying, but I think it's important. I think it's important for a US president who has so many demands on his time and so many problems on the shoulders, to go to a troubled region, to show leadership, to talk to the parties involved, and to try to bring a resolution to a very tragic situation which has been going on for decades. And we do know that many international disputes and many international conflicts are not solved without American leadership and American involvement. Of course, the parties to the conflict, their involvement and their willingness to cooperate is always critical. But you always need American leadership, American assistance to help to bring parties together. So I think it's a good thing that the president is going, so that the situation, of course, the killing can stop, and that we can find a resolution to a really long-standing conflict. As I said, a conflict which is difficult, intractable, and is not insoluble. And as I mentioned Ralph Bunche earlier on, he was a practical optimist. And all leaders that I know and leaders that I've worked with are practical optimists. Even when a situation looks dire and it looks hopeless, they try to find a way, and they work hard to find a solution. The international agreement, the solutions never agreed by everybody, but they find a way to bring people together. I think of another example of Nelson Mandela in a very difficult situation in South Africa. When we look back, these things always seem easy, but extraordinarily difficult. And he was able to bring suffering people to the negotiating table to make these painful compromises and to bring about a transition from a brutal, oppressive apartheid system in South Africa to a multiracial democracy. So I am hopeful. I am a practical optimist in the Ralph Bunche mode, and I think it's important to remember, even at the darkest moments.
I think from a standpoint of norm entrepreneurship, my guess is Biden saw an opportunity, and he probably recognized that the strongest statements he can make are from there. They will be seen differently from a symbolic standpoint. And I imagine that his motivation is to jump on the opportunity in order to set certain norms, and we'll see what he makes of it. I have in general been impressed with his moral clarity, not per se on this conflict, but in general throughout his career, and especially as president. And I'm glad that he's the person showing up to this kind of situation, because he tends to show leadership in these kinds of moments that I think this is a strength of his. And I look forward to seeing what he does, and I hope that it is helpful in making people suffer less.
Hi, my name's Noah Hemley. I go to Fordham University as well. I just wanted to ask more of, we speak on this cooperation, we speak on accountability. The international space is at its root an anarchist thing because there is no higher authority than the sovereignty of states. So, we should look at more on like motivations and what states fear, and how do we get them to cooperate more on a more practical sense, as you speak on practical optimism. My question is more of like, do you feel that we should spend more time and effort trying to change the cultural side of the international space, how the individual people view and how they should pressure their own representatives to act, or we should influence more the entrepreneurs, the technocracy aspect of it? Should we try to promote these ideas of, these organizations outside of governments having more power, doing more good? Or do you think that's a bit of a slippery situation?
I think that's a very good question. Do we need to put an or in the question?
I guess I'm trying to like effective altruism, like what is the more effective, to change the cultural aspects of people is always going to be harder, but it's almost like more effective because the people determine the governments and they determine the actions that we see in the international space. But it is quicker and a little bit more of a shortcut to have these NGOs and businesses and outside organizations that do have this incredible influence in the 21st century. So I was just trying to think, would it be more worthwhile to go for the longer solution rather than the shorter, or do we just not have enough time in this day and age? That's kind of more where I'm social. But both would be fantastic.
Yeah, I don't see them as being in conflict. It does feel to me like one takes time and different kinds of large, coordinated effort that can take a lot of resources and a lot of time, but has huge benefits. The other one is something we can do in the meantime. There's an analogy to how so I've worked a little bit in health, as I mentioned, and in particular I've worked on combating TB. And if you ask the Gates Foundation how we're going to combat TB, we're going to find a cure for TB. And that's where they're putting a ton of their money. That may take 40, 50 years. They're probably right that eventually we will find a cure for TB, and that's going to be awesome. But in the meantime, what should we do? Well, we should get people to take the existing medications, and we should make improvements around that. And so I think there's an analogy here. We can fight on both fronts.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I think, again, yeah, you fight and work at different levels. Individuals are always a key to the puzzle, as I see it, and I'm a great believer in individual agency. So you work, we come together in our communities. You at Fordham, as you say, you come together and you work at the universities, you cooperate at the local level. There is a role for cities, and cities can work to deal with issues and problems which national governments cannot solve. National governments are important, and certainly, as in line with much of what I've been saying this afternoon, international institutions are also key. So you work at different levels to bring about change, systemic change, and then also change in terms of institutional change.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We'll go back here. This will be the last one.
This is Nadia from Afghanistan and currently student of master's program in humanitarian action. I have a question. How can we develop a cooperative and environment among UN agencies and also non-UN agencies for cooperation? I can give you the example of Afghanistan right now, that just UN and some UN agencies, they have present in the country, but for the other NGOs, they're just waiting if the government to be recognized or just for the new government. So how do you think we can create a sort of cooperation among UN and non-UN agencies?
You said UN agencies?
Yeah, UN
yes.
agencies and also the
non-UN
other
agencies.
organizations. Yeah.
Yes, it's usually a challenge. It was a challenge that I faced, of course, in peacekeeping, in various peacekeeping missions, 3 peacekeeping missions in North Macedonia, in Haiti, and in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, because you have a plethora of different UN agencies on the ground, and then you also have non-UN agencies, and how you bring them together is always a challenge. One of the things that usually helps is that you focus on the comparative advantage that each agency has. So if you're working on education, then UNESCO is in the lead on that. So you look, it's a health issue, you try to bring WHO involved. So you look at the issue and try to utilize the comparative advantage of the particular agency. And in some of the missions, there's a great deal of advance which has been done with integrating, say, the development side of the UN system with the political and peacekeeping side, and that has helped.
I think this one is really subject matter expertise.
So with that, I want to thank you all for being here with us, both in person and online. Ethics is almost meaningless without conversation and dialogue, and so we need you, and we welcome your engagement, particularly on Global Ethics Day. So our sincere thanks for your time. I also want to thank the Carnegie staff, worked extremely hard, especially Kevin Maloney, for organizing this event, and also commend the staff on the title of this event, Unlocking, I was thinking about this, Unlocking Cooperation, and this conversation makes me believe that it's within us, if we can just find a way to sort of unlock it, to sort of access it in some way. And finally, thank you to our panelists, Avi and Erez, for showing us the way. I mean, our job is to sort of imagine, a better future based on experience and principles, but there's a path there, and you're practical optimists. So thank you for sharing this time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.